The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John. Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him, because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. When he looked up and saw a large crowd coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to Jesus, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they among so many people?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were satisfied, he told his disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over, so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up, and from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, "This indeed is the prophet who is to come into the world." When Jesus realized that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself. The Gospel of the Lord. I said last week that at the normal spot where we would read St. Mark's account, one of them, of the multiplication of the loaves and the fish, instead now we read St. John's account, and we'll be reading the teaching that follows it for the next several weeks. It speaks of this happening at the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. The Jews referred to this as the Sea of Galilee. But late in the 1st century, the town of Tiberias on its southern shore was established, and it started to become popular to call it the Sea of Tiberias. And so John's Gospel, which was written and published later than the others, reflects an awareness of this tradition, that the name was kind of in the process of changing. Jesus goes up the mountain, he sits down with his disciples, and we hear that the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. If we only read Matthew, Mark, and Luke's Gospel, we would only hear of one Passover during Jesus' public ministry, the Passover, the day before his death. However, John's Gospel speaks not of one, but of 3 different Passovers. And it's because of that we know that the ministry of Jesus was not just part of a year or a year long, but more than 2 years long. And so we traditionally say it was 3 years of public ministry, because there were 3 Passovers accounted for during this ministry. John also likes to remind his people of what Jewish festivals were being celebrated, so that Christians would make a connection of how these old celebrations are being taken over and given new life in Christ. And so we will see that the celebration of the Passover meal will be replaced with our Last Supper. That's part of the importance of him constantly reminding us of the festivals. There's not enough food for this huge crowd. And Jesus could have just snapped his fingers and out of nowhere prepared enough food, but that's not typically how God works. God typically looks to see what can be offered and then tries to work miracles with that. And so this boy with 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, certainly enough to feed himself, maybe a friend or two, but not 5,000 people. But Jesus takes that and works this great miracle. And listen to the words that describe how he does it. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated, and so also the fish, as much as they wanted. Each one of the 6 accounts that we have in our 4 Gospels of the multiplication of the loaves and the fish seem shaped by the words that the church uses during the consecration. The words I will speak in a few moments' time are very similar to this. It speaks to the fact that the church loved this story so much because it helped them to understand what Jesus was doing when he instituted the Eucharist and when they gathered together for the Eucharist, which they called in the early days the breaking of the bread. Notice how the fish is kind of an also ran. At the tail end, there's also mention of the fish. But when they're picking up the leftovers, there's no mention at all of the fish. Now, I doubt that you can get 12 baskets full of bread and not have any fish left over. But that wasn't what was important. It's the bread which is the focus of this great miracle. And then, what's the reaction? The people see the sign that Jesus has done. John's Gospel doesn't like talk of miracles. It prefers talk of signs. And what is a sign? It's something that points to a greater reality. Even a stop sign is just a square like this with the word stop in 2 languages in this country and in 1 language in most other countries. But we know what it means. We know that if you don't stop, somebody might slam right into you and be the end of you. But the signs of John's Gospel, it's pointing to the special relationship of Jesus with the Father and a relationship that is meant to be shared with his disciples and his followers. And so much so that when they saw this sign, they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." It was Moses who first spoke of such a prophet, and he did so near to the ending of his own life. He said that in days to come, God would send them a prophet like himself. And so that's one of the expectations of the Messiah, a prophet like unto Moses. And here the people are starting to recognize this indeed is the prophet who is to come into the world.